Hey
noises,
guys, welcome back.
maybe
I
stuff
just
like
bought
that. And I
Pirates
think
of the
that's a
Caribbean.
really good addition when they put it here. And I think that's why they probably waited a while until there was
We're
like more detail with the
gonna try
scenery from
Black
the
Ops
sea
6 later.
to add it into this. And what is this? Is that an eye vendor? Is that a... What is that? What is that? Pickaxe?
I've done a lot of
No.
gold coins as a
Throw that
block,
axe.
and this one's
What
pretty
is
cool.
that? What is that? Is this netherrack? I think this is netherrack. So this is obsidian or bedrock. Probably one of the two. I think it's obsidian. And then that's like... I'm familiar what it is because they've released a new nether update now on Minecraft, on Bedrock. Check that out, please. You should get it. It's absolutely amazing. It is worth the wait of like 10 minutes, I think. Megabytes. And it seems to be, I think that's the island that we've already explored. But to be honest, I don't think there's nothing else. There's a few ships over there that we could have a bit of a check out. But I think I'm just going to run over to this island. I think we've already seen. Go over and have a bit of a check.
In the remote wilderness of Alaska, there's an island known as Kodiak Island, home to one of the largest bear species on Earth, the Kodiak bear. These bears are a subspecies of the brown bear, but have lived in isolation for around 12,000 years, allowing them to evolve into a unique and awe-inspiring animal. The Kodiak bear is massive, with males weighing up to 1,500 pounds. A fascinating aspect of Kodiak bears is their remarkable memory and intelligence. Researchers have found that these bears can remember where they found food years later, often returning to the same places in the same season. This trait is crucial for survival on the island, where harsh winters require a fat reserve built up from a summer of intense feeding. In the remote wilderness of Alaska,
Hold on.
First, they're not like, oh my goodness, someone's abducted Bobby, because there's no one on this road. They've come up here and recognized that it's very remote, it's isolated, there's no cars that come through here, they hadn't heard anything, and so their first instinct was, okay, he probably got up, and is behind a tree, or he walked down the hill over here, or he's nearby. And so they're yelling for him, they're walking around, and no one's panicking yet. In fact, really, Edna was just annoyed with Jimmy that he had left, Bobby, and that he's to blame right now, but it's just an inconvenience at this point. But after a couple of minutes, when they can't get Bobby to yell back where he is, they start to realize they might have a problem here. And so Edna becomes more panicked, and she's yelling at the top of her lungs for her son. She's having her other two sons go look down by the water, go look over there, but there's no trace of him. And they can't believe it. It didn't make any sense, because, he's 4, he's got no shoes on, they didn't hear anything. How could he be gone? But he was gone. And so finally, after a couple of minutes, Edna rounded up her other two boys, and they ran all the way back to the campsite where they got Mr. Pac-Man, and they hailed the police, and very quickly, a big search was launched up on that logging road. As soon as the police arrived, the first thing they did is they pressed Pac-Man and the other two boys about, what did you hear? You had to have heard something. He was only 10 feet away from you, and he was within earshot of you, certainly. What did you hear? Did a vehicle come through? Did you hear an animal?
Where the fuck up, nigger?
Edna and the other two boys, they swore that they heard nothing.
I'm gonna fucking
that they're
kill you,
just
cunt.
as baffled by it as anybody else. And so the police really didn't have a
I'm
good
gonna fucking
starting
kill you,
point
mountain
where
niggers.
Bobby could have gone.
Gonna
And
slit
in
your
that
goddamn
area, there
throats.
wasn't any safe drop-offs or obvious places that Bobby could have fallen into or gotten trapped. The water for the waterfall, it's not deep. It's this little tiny brook. You know, it'd be difficult to drown in that little brook. So they just basically started fanning out in all directions.
Goddamn you, mountain
Find a
niggers.
piece of clothing or some other clue that would indicate where he went. After
Fucking
3 days of
touch their
searching
goddamn
that
throats.
yielded
I hate
nothing,
this
they
cunt.
finally brought in a bloodhound to try to find him based on scent. And so they had the dog smell one of Bobby's shoes, and the dog immediately seemed to key in on his scent in the area where Bobby had gone missing. And the dog turns and starts running up the logging road away from the campsite, so farther into the forest. And it runs for almost 2 miles, and it never seems to waver. It's clearly picked up Bobby's scent.
I'm glad I picked
And it
this one.
stops at this fork in the road about 2 miles away from where Bobby had gone missing, and it keys in on this one area right at the fork where there wasn't anything significant. It was just this bare patch of dirt. And so the police, they uncover the dirt a little bit. There's nothing there. They're looking around the area. That there's no indication that Bobby was ever here. So they give the scent back to the dog, and again, the dog just keeps tracking this one section in this fork in the road. But they didn't know what to do with that information because there was nothing there. The search for Bobby was called off after 7 days because they could not find anything. And so the lead investigator came out and did this press release where he basically said, "We have no idea what happened to Bobby. However, we do think he was abducted." And his reasoning for this was pretty straightforward. Bobby was a young kid that had no shoes on in an unfamiliar forest, and he was only out of eyesight for 2 minutes. So how far could he really have gotten? Certainly not far enough that his family wouldn't have found him after those 2 minutes were up and they began looking for him. And so if you go down the abduction rabbit hole, you start with, okay, a person must have taken Bobby. But for a person to take Bobby, that means a person had to be in this area that was super isolated and remote, and they hadn't seen anybody in the area, and there were very few campers at the campsite. So realistically, if a person was going to abduct Bobby, they had to have been planning it and had to have been hiding in the trees and were stalking this family until they got to that spot where Jimmy left Bobby, and then this person, runs out of the tree line, runs over to Bobby, picks him up without Bobby making a sound, he muffles him, and he runs away into the woods carrying this child, all in a 2-minute window, which was a totally abrupt window. It wasn't like this obvious thing that Bobby was going to be left alone. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which would have been a deterrent, you would think, that someone was trying to abduct Bobby. But nonetheless, this window presents itself and this person runs down and takes Bobby. It just seems like that person would need to be really fixated on Bobby, one. There wasn't a clear reason for why anyone would be very fixated on Bobby or this family. And two, they would need to be very strong and quick and agile, more than the average person. So we're talking like a professional athlete level of agility and physical fitness. And so while it's certainly possible that a professional athlete had been stalking this family and then ran down in this tiny little window of time and stole Bobby away without getting detected and evaded the law for 7 days in the middle of the woods, while that's possible, it's pretty unlikely. And investigators reached this conclusion. They thought, it does seem pretty unlikely that a person did this. So they moved on to animals, and they said, okay, maybe a bear took Bobby. And so they brought out bear-sniffing dogs to search the area for signs that a bear had been there, and there hadn't been. And so they said, okay, maybe a cougar had been there. And so they brought out a cougar expert who looked around the area, and there was no signs of a cougar in the area. Plus, there was no blood anywhere around the area where Bobby had been taken. There was no drag marks where if a predator were to grab you, they would need to drag you away. There was no drag marks. So it seemed like, okay, the large predator theory also has problems with it. And so the next theory offered up was, well, maybe a giant eagle swooped down and picked Bobby up and flew him away, which would account for why maybe it was quiet and there was no drag marks, there was no blood, and why he was gone. But that was when authorities said, okay, we clearly have no clue. And so that's why they gave the press release and basically said, we just don't know. And so while we probably will never know what happened to Bobby, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent, it was fast, it was strong, it was agile, and it had been watching that family. Because as soon as that 2-minute window presented itself, where Jimmy was gone and Bobby was vulnerable, it swept in so fast that no one heard it, no one saw it, and it took Bobby somewhere and did something to him. Whatever it did, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold, there might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful, and our stuff's getting wet, and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside, and so the pair decided, you know what, we got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. So they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point, they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are, and now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map, and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going, when his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything. He said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight, and it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before, and so it makes sense he might be tired. But, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute, and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated, and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense, and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up, it was still snowing and they're still lost. He had that optimism, and so did his son. But now, thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of this situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, He said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders, and for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son, and he puts his son down by a tree, he sits down next to him, totally defeated, and he's like, we gotta get ready to go to the we gotta get back up in the tree, we gotta do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree tonight, because he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see, and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here, I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline. And he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest, and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. What were those things? And so he stands there for a minute, thinking to himself, am I losing my memory? What's going on? And he turns around and starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now. And my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. What's going on with my son? So he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in the snow. And finally it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding on to his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they parked their car over a large mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigzagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found the road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon, that the fire inspector's son was missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up the mountain as well to assist in the search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks. But no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? Why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. In early July July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just came out of the cabin, and then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin, and so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. The 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were also just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried, because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, see Geraldine, where'd she go? They're like, oh, we don't know, she was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside, and so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there, because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other, and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking, we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming.
I love this matchup back.
And
Why I
even if
didn't get
Geraldine
some
had
fucking
sprinted
down.
for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot, and all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the Army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where the footprints dissipated.
Yes,
And
I'm
so the
gonna
search
go.
effort
Someone
was
eat.
pushed to the swamp, and thousands of people
I'll be
that
right
are
back.
combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this
Like,
girl.
comment, subscribe.
And once again, there's nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search,
Actually,
they
you know
find
what?
another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for
Might just
Geraldine.
chat.
But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints. And if
You
it
know
was
what?
a human print,
I'll go on to
they would
YouTube.
need to be an enormous
Like, comment,
human
subscribe.
being.
I'll catch you in
Or
the next
these
video.
prints
Peace out.
belong to some enormous animal.